last time what we covered was the history of the secret space program in the United States, or the NASA and the more secretive aspects beyond, like Area 51.
Yeah.
Begun in the late 1940s with the Cold War CIA. And we kind of brought a big picture together that extends back to the time of Gnosticism, all the way up to the CIA, where you kind of find the logical culmination of Masonic goals that have been in development for a while over the centuries. In finance, science, academia, etc., all kind of coming together with the development of the CIA and its deepest research programs. And where that really comes to a center is where you had the branches of what we call the Illuminized Freemasonry, Skull and Bones, the highest levels of Masonry, 33rd degree beyond, and the Nazis, who were part of the Vril Society, all kind of reuniting, converging again, almost like a family reunion in the CIA and in these programs like MK Ultra, remote viewing. I think I mentioned that, but especially the space programs. And there were connections on both sides of the United States, the German side, going back to Aleister Crowley. If these are just some quick points of review.
Yep.
and the high Masonry. So the common ingredient that has always been enduring here is what we've been referring to as Babel's cult, the cult of changing names. But it's essentially Gnosticism, and it is we find it being passed down through that family tree of secret societies. And I think where we really left off last time at the end was I was going to talk about, I'm prepared to talk about right now, the disclosure movement, the UFO disclosure movement that's taken place today, who the key players are, and what its relationship is to that early Masonic and Nazi riddled CIA.
Cool.
And to the space program.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating story. What I'd like to do is I'd like to just dive in to the current events. That is to say, this disclosure movement, who the key players are, who's been involved, and then at the end, more so, I'll work in its connection to the big picture and to all of the history we've been discussing.
Cool.
And in fact, why this is such an incredible point we find ourselves in history. Could go one way or the other, and a lot of that is going to depend on the church rising to the occasion, stepping into their calling.
Mm-hmm.
We'll get to all of that. Okay, so let me just to kind of figure out how to where to begin with relation to the audience, what's common knowledge. What comes to your mind, Jeff, when I say this disclosure movement that's been taken over now? What are some of the bullet points?
Well, the immediate thing is, I listen to Tucker Carlson quite a bit, and he's one that's, pretty quickly and easily making the jump to spiritual,
yes,
spiritual things, that there are beings of spiritual nature, that this is, it's funny, I've heard him say in recent podcast, maybe on Sean Ryan's podcast, but talking about how, the Christians were right all along, kind of thing. And in the sense that when you talk about these spiritual realities, it's like we've known about these other spiritual entities, other gods, just the spiritual realities of the world, and good versus evil, and so having that as an explanation isn't far-fetched for us. It's what we're used to.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But having to come to terms with an explanation in this day and age, it seems like logical people it's easy for them to start making the jump of like, well,
Okay,
this is
that's so great that you actually led the conversation with that, because it kind of lands right on the center point of relevance to everything, and you'll see what I'm getting at here. Okay. So what is interesting is Tucker Carlson is one of the few people you'll see on popular media platforms nowadays who are actually entertaining all of this through a biblical lens. He's actually used the word Nephilim.
Yeah, definitely.
However, that puts him in the minority. Mm-hmm. And what is so neat is that the people who have been leading the disclosure movement, one thing we can all seem to agree on is that there is something of a spiritual nature. I don't know of any person who's looked to as a serious figurehead or expert in this topic who is actually saying anymore that these are just merely interplanetary beings of a strictly physical, biological nature as we know life. Mm-hmm. They've all made provision for the idea of these being interdimensional, and let's just accept that is kind of what, even in the congressional hearings 2 years ago, there was talk to that effect. And so now the race is on between what we've been talking about here, between Babel's cosmology and Bible's cosmology. Who's going to make sense of this? And okay, so there's a fascinating story about how all of this went mainstream in 2017. And after 70 years of the public being gaslit by a concerted effort between academia, the government, and mainstream media to make us seem stupid and crazy to even want to look into this UFO topic, suddenly everything shifts, right? About 2016, 2017, the New York Times breaks an article, and suddenly that's everybody else's cue to it's okay to start talking about this without stigma.
Yeah.
Well, I'll get into how that came about and who was leading that publicity campaign.
Okay.
And with what interesting implications for this war of worldviews between the Bible and Babel. But first we need to give the backstory, because it really all goes back to what was originally top secret in 2007. And this is part of what they've been covering as a whistleblower movement.
Okay.
Now, you guys will probably recognize these names. And first of all, I want to give credit to the New York Post, Stephen Greenstreet, because he did an excellent, he has a show called The Basement Office or something to that effect. And he's done an excellent series of presentations covering the history of it and making it simple for people who want to kind of get caught up. And I've drawn a large part from him and how he's been able to simplify all of this. But, it all goes back to the birth of what they referred to as ATIP in 2007. That was the Department of Defense's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And this was I think synonymously referred to or alternatively referred to or overlapping with another program as to virtually be the same, called OSWAP, Advanced Aerospace Weapon System Application Program. It's fascinating because what this all turns out to be is not just their research on UFO phenomena, but all related to paranormal phenomena. Paranormal being a choice of word they're comfortable with. Okay. That was never questioned from day one. And you've heard of the Skinwalker Ranch show that's enormously popular, and it's always kind of all the rage. Well, that's where it all began.
Okay.
Okay, and so who were the key players in the organization of this program, of this research program? And by the way, part of what they wanted to find out was the relationship that UFOs and paranormal phenomena have to each other. And we're talking about the buffet, the whole spectrum of paranormal phenomena, which happens to be concentrated on Skinwalker Ranch. It's a place known for its, for every possible paranormal phenomena you could conceive of. It's there happening regularly. And
Where's that located?
Utah, the Utah desert somewhere. Actually, and so I'll just follow my bullet points here because that'll all get answered anyway. So Nevada Senator Harry Reid. Again, this is in 2007. Around that time, he was the one who initiated the program's development with a $22 million budget of seed money. I'm guessing from U.S. taxpayers. B. Robert Bigelow, the founder of Bigelow Aerospace, to whom the program was contracted out by the DoD. Now, isn't that interesting? The DoD contracts out the project to a private industry. That's kind of how it's always been run. That's the essence of the secrecy, the ability to keep it away from official government sources and accountability.
Mm-hmm.
C. James Lakatsky, a scientist from DIA, or Defense Intelligence Agency, who served as the program's first director. D. Luis Elizondo, a Pentagon official who served as the second director of program, and he becomes the face of the whistleblower movement in 2017 when it goes mainstream, when all of this goes mainstream. He was the one who started appearing on news outlets like Fox and CNN after the New York Times broke the story of his involvement with ATIP. E, a most interesting figure, Dr. Hal Puthoff, a quantum physicist and parapsychologist who headed the program's research. Now, what I'm about to say here gives us a glimpse into its connection to the big picture, to the Cold War history of the 20th century. Uh-huh. It is most relevant to this big picture that Dr. Puthoff was an initiate of the highest rank in Scientology. The cult started by JPL co-founder L. Ron Hubbard, the disciple of Aleister Crowley, the occultist of high Freemasonry who contributed to the rise of Nazism and the U.S. space programs, as discussed in previous episodes. Mm-hmm. It is also relevant that Dr. Hal Puthoff was a leading figure in the CIA's remote viewing program, Project Stargate, along with his colleague, Russell Targ. Russell Targ, by the way, was the inspiration for the Ghostbuster figures. Ghostbuster character with the glasses and kind of the bushy head of hair. I can't remember his name. The scientist.
Okay, nice.
And Nazi rocket scientist Werner von Braun helped them start the CIA's remote viewing program of psychic third eye spies, since it was inspired by the paperclip recruited Nazis to begin with. Mm-hmm. We could talk more about these connections later. F. Dr. Colm Keller, a biochemist with the research team. G. Dr. Eric Davis, an astrophysicist with the team, who has admitted to researching recovered off-world vehicles, as I believe were his choice of words, off-world vehicles. Okay. Now, all of these researchers named were chosen because of notable work they had done on wedding science with the paranormal. Think teleportation, telepathy, telekinesis, and psychic phenomena. They had done papers on these sort of things. Mm-hmm. What else do all of these persons have in common? They have become the lead faces of the highly coordinated publicity campaign in more recent times to popularize these topics and render them intelligible within academia, mainstream news, and edutainment. This would include the acclaimed History Channel series Ancient Aliens and Skinwalker Ranch. The latter being about the mysterious Utah property where this DIA advanced research program actually took place, well before it was a household name. A turf of land formerly owned by Robert Bigelow, known for its assortment of spooky things that go bump in the night. So from UFOs to werewolves, skinwalkers, Bigfoot phenomena, ghosts, poltergeist phenomena, all kinds of cryptids. Everything mainstream scientists would have been embarrassed to mention, maybe just before 2017.
Okay.
Now suddenly these things are being brought before us, and an interesting series of books were put out by them. One by James Lukaski, very intelligent man, who was on this team. I think called Skinwalkers at the Pentagon.
Hmm.
Now, for those of us, as you now that you touched on this, now for those of us who subscribe to a biblical worldview, the interconnectivity of these supernatural categories posits no philosophical difficulty. They find a cohering bottom line in demonology and the principles of spiritual warfare, which tend to reveal themselves in patterns of behavior. Patterns of behavior. For example, anyone who truly wishes to search out the matter can find that there's an abundance of first-hand testimony, be it from your local communities or from around the world, and different places, which validate the fact of such encounters with the said entities. In fact, I'll just give a little testimonial here real quick. I'm marking my spot so I don't lose it. Part of what I did my master's work on interestingly, at the same time in 2007, 2008, is I remember I had to do an ethnography on millennials about like what they believe about spirituality. So I went to the Mall of America one day in Minnesota, spent a 16-hour day there or something of that sort, 14 hours, and just interviewed a bunch of millennials, and I had a questionnaire, and I basically approached them in as disarming a manner as possible, and asked them seriously if they ever had any experiences that they felt were supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
And I was amazed at how a lot of and I did my best to make sure I was talking to somebody who looked level-headed, and like they were all there. And I was amazed at how when they felt that what they had to say on this was going to be taken seriously, they kind of let their guard down, and they were kind of relieved to start talking about some of these things.
Okay.
And the majority of them either directly had experienced something in their life, which they say hands down supernatural, can't explain it. Some of them say, I can't explain it, I believe it was a demon or this. We're talking like an apparition, a very concrete event, or they knew somebody that happened to them,
Mm-hmm.
whom they would consider level-headed. And so one day when I was telling my family about this research project, my extended family, my uncle, who's the most Minnesotan, kind of quiet, level-headed guy, I would have never expected this from him. But he volunteered this. He said, "Well, yeah, when my brother and I were about 11 years old, we slept in the same room on our farm in Iowa, and suddenly we're woken up in the middle of the night to the whole room is trembling. A strong beam of light is coming in through the windows. We get up, we run outside, and we see this huge orb of it was like an amber orange glowing color, not far above, not flying at a very high altitude, hovering above their house slowly. And they got a good look at this thing for several minutes. We're not talking seconds. Anyways, there's an abundance of those stories.
Wow.
And it's not hard for anyone of us to find those sort of things.
Yeah.
But what is interesting, and then you can also find, okay, so just jumping back into my notes here, by way of pattern, you will often hear of a unique putrid odor associated with these events, like the smell of sulfur or rotting eggs or something of that sort, that distinct smell, which is also commonly reported with exorcisms. Talk to priests who conduct exorcisms, and they will tell you about this distinct putrid sulfuric odor.
Okay. Huh.
But with equal consistency, you will also hear about the power that the name of Jesus Christ has to repel these demonic visitors, but to do so permanently. In many cases, the name of Jesus has the proven power, proven because of its repeatability, to permanently end their harassments of people who once suffered these things routinely.
Mm-hmm.
And this is commonly reported among abductees. And there are people like Dr. Michael Heiser who've done incredible research on this pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the most fascinating thing about it is that the main figureheads of the whistleblower movement don't want to interact with this information. It ruins their, well, we'll get to this, but their cosmological narrative that's pushing Babel's end of the spectrum.
Gotcha.
In this sense, the fact of this whole paranormal discussion going mainstream should be seen by the church, I think positively, as a great opportunity to make sense of spiritual worldview in the way I would argue, and that you would argue, that only the Bible can. But here's the problem. The orbit of people who have been spearheading this UFO disclosure movement, namely the Skinwalker gang, as I call them,
Mm-hmm.
are the ones holding the megaphone.
Yeah.
That is, they have the advantage of mainstream media and other platforms at their command. And they are not interested much to give the biblical perspective on this phenomena a fair hearing. I'm trying to do something about this lighting. It's all right. Yeah. All right. To the contrary, they seem to be promoting Babel's cosmology as the new in quotes, emerging religion that at last can be compatible with science and quantum physics.
Mm-hmm. Which would be like, I'll let you go on. I wonder if it's seems like there's like the explanation that these are this is us, time travelers from the future, or
Right.
there's also we are created by these beings. There's a number of explanations, I guess.
Right. Even the people who have been talking about the time traveler theory, I've noticed, are pushing Babel's end of the spectrum. They'll still admit to, but we were helped in our evolution, as they will refer to it, by higher beings from other worlds. So let me back up and be more specific about who I'm talking about when I say they.
Yeah.
Besides the people I've already mentioned, the Skinwalker gang. Who are the Skinwalker gang's media associates? This gets into the story of how the named individuals of this highly classified program, Louis Elizondo, doctors James Lukatsky, Hal Puthoff, Holm Keller, Erica Davis, and company, went on to become public faces of a supposed whistleblower movement on UFOs. And yes, I'm implying that I'm not totally sure this is a sincere whistleblower movement and that they were ever in the kind of danger that, and maybe to some extent, sure, maybe they were making waves with a very layered intelligence community, but at the end of the day, they seem to have a blessing from the higher ups, from the highest level possible, because the doors in the media that all opened up for them don't just open up for anybody.
Right.
And I'm not making a formal accusation, but as we look into how this publicity campaign unfolded, I think we're getting a waft of a classic Mockingbird operation.
Gotcha.
So it all began in October of 2017 when there was a major press conference held by a team of gentlemen associated with this Skinwalker research. Luis Elizondo was one of them. He's kind of become the face of the movement. And then they got some star power. They recruited some star power in Blink 182 singer Tom DeLonge, however you pronounce his name.
That's right. I remember seeing some of those clips.
And Tom DeLonge had become the founder or president of To the Stars Academy, a think tank about the idea of exactly that, going to the stars, contacting these beings, these extra dimensionals or interplanetary / extra dimensionals. It's interesting. He's blatantly made comments about these are the Greek gods of old, and they're making a comeback. Okay.
Interesting.
A most interesting figure here. I mentioned Dr. Hal Puthoff. He was part of this press conference in October of 2017. And Chris Mellon, a national security affairs advisor with a former one with the Department of Defense. Chris Mellon. Now, why does that name sound familiar? I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but he came from the Skull and Bones affiliated Mellon family, who were at the center of the orbit, which I always refer to as the Super Six from the Cold War 1950s.
Yeah.
Averell Harriman, Prescott Bush, the Dulles brothers, and the Rockefeller brothers.
Okay.
This guy's pretty much could be. He's one of their own. He's okay. On this inside clique. Gotcha. By the way, I mean his grandpa Paul Mellon, or gotcha. I don't know what the precise relationship is, but he comes from that Mellon family.
Gotcha.
And this patriarch from the 1950s, Paul Mellon, was in fact one of the ones, it's come up in recent times, who with Alan Dulles helped retrieve the Nazi disc technology after World War II and bring it to the United States with, the innermost circle of them all. So isn't that an interesting set of connections? And especially will get more interesting when we talk about Dr. Hal Puthoff's connections, which we've only listed a couple. Okay, so then when they held this press conference and pretty much said something like, we're going to be whistleblowers. It's time we're going to spearhead transparency. We're going to demand it. And here we go. But that was a first domino to fall. See, that same fall, November 2017, or even that same month, October 2017, was kind of the next seminal event as far as the mainstream coverage went, when a Huffington Post reporter, Leslie Kean, and her associate from the New York Times published a post on this program, the Skinwalker program, called Glowing Auras, and or something to that effect. Glowing Auras and Black Money, the Pentagon's mysterious UFO program. And that was the tip of the spear. All of the dominoes then started to fall. This started to become covered by CNN, Washington Post, Fox, CBS, Newsweek, Boston Globe, you name it. That's why I say it has the markings of a classic Mockingbird op, because that's how it always worked. It was a pipeline, an echo chamber. Right. And then these guys like Louis Elizondo would be using the same talking point, quote, "We may not be alone," end quote, on all of these programs,
Sure, yeah, there's the repeatable line.
What's so fascinating about all of this is the spiritual pulse. Mm-hmm. Okay, let me just say, before I say what that spiritual pulse is, let me just mention a few names. Those who have been following this topic will recognize these names. If I can find them here, yeah. So what I just talked about was like the first orbit of media associates that could be called mainstream. But just outside of that orbit is another whole conglomerate of media affiliates who probably wouldn't consider themselves mainstream. They're like podcasters. And in fact, they would probably say, we're fighting the mainstream. We're with the whistleblowers. They'd be the first ones to stick it to the military-industrial complex, the CIA, so on. But there's a like-mindedness in a platform. Now, some of these are podcasts, and I'm not bashing these guys so much because I really actually enjoy their content. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about some of the most interesting, likable people. And like, for example, Theory of Everything podcast, Danny Jones podcast. I would say these are just a slight step below Joe Rogan and some of those other I think these are highly popular. They'll have all kinds of people on here that are very well known. And so in a sense, they're kind of the mainstream media as it's the line's blurring. But okay, so the media associates of this Skinwalker gang became people like George Knapp, Jeremy Corbell, and then these are people who have also become regular guests on major outlets like Fox or CNN. And then the News Nation, Ross Coulthart, Chris Cuomo, even, who used to be with CNN, has been covering this topic with News Nation. And then there's been some other journalists like Linda Moulton Howe. There's a woman who's on making her rounds in all these podcasts named Dr. Diana Pasulka. Chris Bledsoe is a man who has an extraordinary story. He owned land in North Carolina. He started receiving these visits from, well, essentially these beings that were like the old Sumerian or Egyptian gods, Hathor, and it was all wrapped in the UFO phenomena. And
yeah.
I single him out for a moment because he comes across as a very likable guy, a very articulate man, a very humble type of man, the type of man you take seriously. And, he has this whole story of how he was kind of persecuted by the church. I'm not questioning the sincerity of it. He probably did have a bad experience because a lot of people in the church don't know how to talk about this. They approach it so simplistically. And maybe he did get poorly treated. And so, he's been advocating Babel's cosmology. And I'm naming all of these names because I feel like I need to give the specificity, because these people are all in each other's orbits. They're interactive, and they're a like-minded gang. And that like-mindedness is Babel's cosmology. Even Luis Elizondo on the Theory of Everything podcast, and it's called the Theory of Everything podcast because it's about kind of understanding a quantum physics perspective of what makes sense of everything. That's kind of the pitch. That's the brand. And so Luis Elizondo has done in recent years, he's been on the show, and now he's talking about ancient astronaut theory in the sense of, yes, we were engineered by a spacefaring race. And he'll occasionally offer these subtle jabs to say, I'm sorry, but the church doesn't want to hear about this. It's too scary. And he even talked about once how somebody in the Pentagon discouraged him from pursuing the UFO topic because that person, unnamed person in the Pentagon, but he said it was somebody of high rank, said, we know that these are demons.
Yeah.
But Luis Elizondo relayed that exchange between them as if the man was ignorant and close-minded, and in such a way as to suggest those who are really open-minded and in the know are gravitating toward Babel's cosmology.
Gotcha.
Now, what's so frightening, and this is what I mentioned last time, is that there are also people in this orbit that I just named who are occasionally referencing things like Nordic-looking extraterrestrials, as they refer to them, blonde, tall, blue-eyed. And it's really the same sort of stuff that we heard from Nazism. And the way they speak of them in such glowing terms, Linda Moulton Howe, who is one of these reporters, has said that not only are our highest aerospace engineers still working with these beings, but that they have even told them that a group of ancestors to this alien race engineered the human race, and that they came from Sirius A and Sirius B star systems. Now, where have we heard that before?
Right.
I think I mentioned it last time. That was one of the main. These are one of the main star systems that goes back to what Albert Pike talked about in connection with ancient astronaut theory, the Great Mason, and the what Aleister Crowley talked about. His contact, supposedly from Sirius, was the one that kind of spearheaded this vision for a space industry in the hands of ranking Freemasons.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then there are people. I'll just throw out a couple more names, and then I'll get into tie some knots back to the big picture history of this.
Okay.
In the same orbit, you have people like J.J. Hurtak and others who, you'll occasionally, Billy Carson, you'll occasionally see them commenting on shows like Ancient Aliens, but they're also pushing a Gnostic perspective. And the God of the Bible, of course, they'll say is the real devil or something to that effect. And that guy I just mentioned, J.J. Hurtak, he was highly connected to the intelligence community. He seemed to have worked, or speaks as though he had worked in their remote viewing program, CIA Stargate. Now these are big names from the 1950s who's pioneered this stuff along with MK Ultra. Dr. Andrei Puharich, whose friend who is involved with him in seances and conjuring spirits was Gene Roddenberry, who produced Star Trek. And a lot of this belief system gets written into Star Trek.
Wow.
And then a whole stream of propaganda projects, including The Day the Earth Stood Still in the 1950s, came right out of the heart of these CIA programs with pushing Babel's worldview. What I'm saying here is that everything is on track that they planned back in the early 50s, because I think, as I talked about in a previous episode, Alan Dulles, the Super Six, who are involved in pioneering not just the CIA but also the United Nations, were very intentional about propagating in the UFO package a global world religion compatible with their Gnosticism, their theosophy. They planned on making the world religion through the United Nations. So this is heavy duty business. And unfortunately, I think I feel like I should just shut up now and let you talk or ask whatever questions you want to say. But let me just put it this way. Let me just say this one thing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there are Christians who indirectly are laying out the red carpet for this kind of deception because they think it's supposed to happen biblically. They think, well, isn't this kind of what prophecy is supposedly all about, that there's going to be the rise of this unstoppable antichrist spirit? The world's supposed to go to darkness and hell and deception in a handbasket. And well, why get in the way of the plan so we can just see this world burn already and Jesus come back? Well, of course, that theology, I would say I disagree with on every level, and it was planted there by Gnostics to begin with. It was a socially engineered propaganda campaign precisely to have that self-defeating effect. I don't know if we've talked about that yet, but we can. And really that we could talk about that later, because we have yet to get into the fact that it really is the church's responsibility to make sense of what's going on. But if we don't have an empowering message, then we're just being losers, or we're not representing the gospel that Jesus represented in the early church. And we're a big part of the problem. It's like we're playing right into the enemy's hands along with everybody else. We share guilt in the deception. I'm getting ahead of myself. From everything I've talked about, I need to make one more connection with these names I've just mentioned and the early CIA and this agenda. Okay, so Dr. Hal Puthoff is a major linchpin. Him and his colleague were part of starting the CIA's program, remote viewing program in the 70s, Project Stargate, but they did it with help from Werner von Braun and other high level Masons in NASA, including 33rd degree Mason, I believe, Edgar Mitchell. And it's just always the same cast of characters coming together and then handing the baton on to a new generation. That appears to be what's going on here. All roads seem to lead back historically to the Super Six, who pioneered the CIA, and these programs which wed the occult and science. So how long will we keep taking the bait? I guess that's the question. What's on your mind now?
Well, I guess it kind of seems that there's a grand unveiling happening on a lot of levels. I mean, I think we see it happening just across the board, but it seems like it's a little more strategically planned, a little more right on time for whatever this agenda is. I'm kind of curious to see kind of what the end game is there as far as they're concerned. Like, what do they expect? As far as the new world order or whatever the global order is it an effort to divulge these things so that everybody can come into alignment with what their religion is, or somehow make it as though this is some sort of I guess I have trouble seeing the mass acceptance of this type of way of thinking or theology or spirituality on a plain level. Like, I see it in its deception, people gravitating to this or that, but it's hard for me to see, like, okay, you're going to roll this out and then you're going to say this is true, and then everyone just jump on board. It's but maybe as you get into more of the plan behind it or how they see it, I might understand how they might think this might work or something, but I don't know. It's definitely interesting.
Yeah, what I find, I've really been enjoying the book of Isaiah. And that really, I think when you really dig into the book of Isaiah and how it opens up all of the other prophets and what they're saying, because all of the prophets build on this, I found the fascinating thing is God, at the beginning of Isaiah, the scene opens up as God, with God as the judge. And let me grab this real quick. He's depicted in his role as opening court.
Yeah, same thing. same thing in Job that I've been reading through, and that's always interesting to me, especially as portrayed by like the Bible Project, which I feel like they do a good job of. But like, it's like you never think about these scenarios in depth. It's like, where are these people things coming from, and what is the it's like,
right.
they ask Satan what he's been doing. I've been roaming to and fro, and it's like, what are they up to, and why are they allowed to come into this kind of open forum kind of thing and present a case? Or it's just an interesting phenomenon that we're not taught. You start to look at some of the Michael Heiser stuff and look at the word Elohim and the way that the Hebrews talked about this realm of the gods, or this idea that there are other beings. But in Isaiah and Job, you see them be allowed to be given some sort of a forum or gathering. Let's come together and talk about what's going on.
That's exactly what he says. He says, God says, let's come together, make your case. And but it's so fascinating. Okay, so and where I'm going with this will have a lot to do with what you had just said before. Like, where is all of this going as far as what's their end in mind with pushing this deception? What is it they're looking to get out of society's response? Okay, so Um, so the fascinating thing about Isaiah is I just find this so beautiful. You know, so much of the Gnostic movement that this UFO movement is, the Gnostic spokesman, part of that common thread is you're hearing them accuse the God of the Bible. The accusation is against God that he is this demiurge, this nasty, dogmatic bully, and he's just so wrathful, you know.
Right.
Well, but that's what so fascinated me. When I decided to dig into the Old Testament and find out what this word wrath is all about, you know what I've discovered? It's actually, there's a very specific pattern to it, and very clear pattern. Whenever God is livid, and there aren't a lot of moments where he's just livid, he's actually incredibly patient.
Yeah.
When all of his buttons have been pushed, like a patient parent who's exhausted every resource to reason with an unruly child, when he does explode in some manner with lividness,
Yeah.
it's always because of something like this. And this is the beautiful statement on which Isaiah opens in somewhere in chapter 3:13. The Lord takes his place in court. He rises to judge the people. The Lord enters into judgment against the elders and leaders of his people, the elite, in other words, of the land. It is you who have ruined my vineyard. The plunder from the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the faces of the poor? Declares the Lord Almighty. With all respect, the Lord goes on a rant, a beautiful rant throughout this book, which unpacks that. And the reoccurring theme is because you've taken advantage of the poor and the oppressed. And because now really he goes through and that was just an opening statement. In God's opening statement, he goes through the list of indictments for which he's drawing everyone to court. And remember, he's drawing two layers to court: the heavens above and their human counterparts, the elite. And he charges them with forming alliances with Babel's system, whether in the form of Assyria or Egypt and the gods. Isaiah 28, he talks in detail about, and elsewhere 57, the pacts they made with the underworld, with Moloch,
Sure.
with the world of the dead,
and that's what John Enlow is kind of emphasizing in the last couple episodes on Elijah List, is that the Lord's enemies are still those, and the spiritual heavyweights, but also the ones that have done the rituals to align themselves with that, to implement the plan.
Because it's an interdependent relationship. They need each other.
Yes.
And so the way Isaiah beautifully unfolds, and I'll just make this real brief here, is that God goes through the list, even in just the opening chapters, the list of his grievances. And so much of it revolves around crushing the poor and corrupting the courts. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, injustice.
Injustice. And then and when in those moments when God wants to sum up his mission on earth, his end game, it's always justice.
Yeah.
And that's what the Messiah will patiently work toward.
Yeah.
He won't be discouraged. 42. I'm just amazed at how much of God's heart's priorities are actually social justice, because we didn't really grow up with this message in our churches. You know, it's just about kind of getting to heaven. And I mean, how could something so basic to God's heart have been so marginalized for so long? So anyways, one thing I was just going to say was, as God works through all this, he starts to go deep into the root issues. And he very specifically clarifies that the root issues of injustice, of corruption, are Babel's gods. Because Babel's gods simply do not have the resources in themselves. Their whole empire is built on greed deception, secrecy. These are all things specified throughout Isaiah that don't allow them to produce the quality of servant leadership that only the Messiah and his people who follow in his ways can produce. They just don't. Their system, Babel's system, is innately hardwired for self-serving, lying types of people. It doesn't lend itself to the kind of democratic virtues where servant leadership is actually at its highest demand.
Right.
At this point in history. However, they're going to have to give lip service to this. The amazing beauty of Isaiah's message as it unfolds is God saying this. He says, I'm going to do something. He says, write it in Isaiah 38. He says, put this on the record, Isaiah. Even if your generation can't appreciate it, a later generation will. Put it on the record as an everlasting witness. That's 38, chapter 30, verse 8. And then he starts to interweave his disclosure of the coming Messiah with this occasional reminder. I'm speaking in code, but you're going to understand this. It's going to be unlocked by retrospect. All of this symbolism he's using, living water, fire, this, that, they all come together in the Holy Spirit. And all along, he's weaving the coming of a new covenant into this promise, a Holy Spirit, and saying that this plan is going to get the enemy at his blind spot. The enemy won't see it coming. He's not even capable. Habakkuk talks about this. He's not even capable of understanding a plan where I would essentially pour out my spirit on the common man, put it inside them, and let that be the way that gradually pushes all that causes sin out of the picture. All this poor thinking about God, and produces the kind of servant leadership that when people experience it, there's no mistaking it. Jesus, we must remember, was a populist in some sense. And the Pharisees only had to resort to orchestrating lies and false witnesses against him to his crucifixion because they exclaimed, look at how the whole world's going after him. They panicked. And that's because, right, Jesus and servant leadership, when seen for what it is, resonates with every moral fiber of the image-bearing human being. And, Martin Luther King Jr., all kinds of people, George Washington Carver, there have been all kinds of people throughout history who have given us a taste of what does it look like when someone has what it takes in their worldview, namely a Christ-centered worldview, to pour out their lives unto death if necessary for making a highway of righteousness go mainstream. And anyways, it's just so just real quick. The people, the moral of the story is that if you don't deal with the root issue, if you don't get rid of Babel's gods, Babel's idols, this is the whole thing Isaiah talks about, you're going to keep having these same problems of corrupt courts.
Yeah.
And if they can just swing the populace into agreement with Babel's cosmology, that's what empowers them at the root level. You're always going to be able to suck people into the deeper web of secrecy, of if you really want to be on the inside and have the powers of unlocking the ether, the life force, what have you. You've got to climb the ladder of initiation. It's a pyramid scheme. It always was.
Sure.
So I think that's kind of, that's the goal. If not coordinated by human, I'm not saying all of these humans have to be twiddling their thumbs thinking of this stuff. No, the burden is not on them to be even that organized. As long as they're buying into Satan's lies, that takes care of itself. The real coordinating is done at the spiritual level by Satan and his cohorts.
So as it pertains to this alien ideology, what does the disclosure of this, the grand revealing of it, finally give them in their minds?
Well, I think
more public trust or more, I guess, like again, like what does everybody knowing about this in their regard, like, does that make it more appealing? Does that make it more
Yeah, they're
uh,
they're they're essentially trying to make the case when you listen to them that this that the ancient Sumerians were right all along. They're trying to push the case that Babel's cosmology, this is just the underlying current that constantly comes out, is this accusation against the biblical God that he's the demiurge and he's not who he said he is. And it's just this, okay, whatever their ultimate thinking, what we know is the same people who gave us Nazism, namely the Super Six, are the same people that wanted to create a world religion through the United Nations and for it to be Gnosticism. They
mm,
want you in their web of thinking, religious worldview. Do you really, at the end of the day, if nothing else, you can think, do I really want to trust or be sucked in to what was being planned for me decades ago by the same people who approved of Nazism
yeah,
when the Judeo-Christian cloaking was taken off?
yeah, yeah, it's almost like you don't even have to join up necessarily. You just have to be subservient to the systems that they're creating.
Right.
You can be inactively uh, or unknowingly involved as you're aborting children, or you're participating in Pride Month, or these are all things that are uh, you know altars and sacrifices and engagement with these gods
Mm-hmm.
and goddesses. So you
Yeah.
can, it's kind of like you don't have to sign up to be in the club. Just let us continue to run things.
Right.
And
Exactly. That
yeah,
agreement is what they need.
yeah,
So well, so what I think, Jeff, is unless for the next episode there's something we've forgotten about this whole history that really needs to be fleshed out more, and maybe that'll occur to mine. Um, I think we should shift gears here and start talking about what the church's response needs to be precisely,
yeah. That's good.
and what the case is for for hope.
Yeah, yeah,
For not throwing in the towel. For hope for a better world, a more just world, a world where Christ's servant leadership can be seen for what it is in the kind of people it produces in all areas of society. And when people get a taste of that, it's like, yes, that's what we needed. We didn't even know that a river as such existed. We've been
mm,
dying of thirst this whole time and didn't even know it. You know,
totally. Well, there's just, it seems like a level of activation and participation that is like, basically like we've been asleep. Uh,
right?
Johnny Enlow's talking about, and other people have been talking about this for a while, but he's starting to bring it more, I think, to a practical sense. It's like traveling to the third heaven, or being a citizen of heaven,
Mm-hmm.
and engaging in the spirit as Jesus did, and that being
Mm-hmm.
also that wasn't special skills of his. That's what we also have access to, but we've been
Mm-hmm.
taught
Right.
that because the occult does X, Y, Z, well then that's bad. But like
Mm-hmm.
the case is that, well, they didn't come up with it. They twisted it. So whatever
Right.
they have are existed first,
Mm-hmm.
um, on the
Mm-hmm.
righteous side, and has
Right.
been copied and twisted and used for their own will or their own endeavors.
Mm-hmm.
Just like we talked before about the throne, how these folks, they don't revere the throne necessarily. They want to tap into the
They
energy of
want
the
to
throne.
sit on the throne. Yeah.
Right.
They,
Yeah.
they, they deified the throne, not the one on it.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that's probably the most important conversation that can happen, and that is happening right now, is like, how do we equip the saints essentially
Mhm.
in light of, and just because it's really hard to have a conversation when these things are in the people's minds
Mhm.
still in conspiracy land, so far fetched, but it's like, no, like, these people they really believe this. They're really committed to the cause, and if you look closely, like I've seen in the lives of some of my friends,
Mhm.
people are buying into this right and left with maybe a new age cloaking or
Mhm.
pseudo
Mhm.
spirituality. I have friends that are like, whatever, talking to Mary Magdalene or
Right,
Isis
the
or whatever.
Gnostic
It's
gospel.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like they're yeah, I don't know. I don't know how they arrived there, but they're fully committed to that cause
Okay.
somehow.
No, okay. No, actually, you give us the perfect note on which to close. I knew something was missing, and that's it. The fact of the matter is that with this great awakening that's taking place, the point I've been kind of making is there's a fake awakening
Yeah,
at this
fakening.
stirring at the same time
Yeah,
and wanting to. They'll, we're talking about people who would be the first to talk against, the CIA, the military-industrial complex. But then at the end of it all, they're trying to reaffirm Babel's cosmology,
yeah. And Jesus was a
and
Freemason, and
they'll say
yeah,
stuff like that, and they'll push an now. Actually, and this all comes to a pinnacle. Just the other day, Jeff. First of all, do you remember how um, in all of this, I've made the case, or we've talked about how God, the Lord Yahweh, appropriately understood in the Bible, has always been the one consistently to empower the oppressed, the common people,
mm,
to
sure,
move to move things toward a culmination which has its logical conclusion in a democracy, an
yeah,
actual democracy that's
yeah,
thriving, literacy, all of these things that empower the common people.
yeah,
I've talked all about that. To my amazement, I think this was just last week. One of those podcasts I mentioned, Danny Jones, which I enjoy listening to, and it covers some very intelligent issues, but it does tend to, the host, Danny, does tend to seem to favor the Babel's worldview with his choice of guests. One of the guests he had recently was a man named Dr. Jason Giorgiani. Now, you could actually look at the divided bars underneath the whole video of that conversation and see what I'm talking about. But this man, who he's like a scholar. He did his doctorate on Prometheus, and he's made it clear that he has various connections to the intelligence community deep. Knew guys like Buchanan of the CIA's remote viewing program, another one of those leading figures. Russell Targ mentioned, so he's kind of in with this crowd. He talked about his dinner with Jack Valet, who's also been part of this Skinwalker thing. Um, he amazingly is making the very opposite, precisely opposite argument I am making. He's saying that Christianity has always, on these specific points, Christianity has always been incompatible with the Constitution and the church at large. He's conflating all of the misdeeds of the Catholic Church with Christianity in general.
gotcha.
It's and he speaks very openly about Yahweh being the demiurge, very passionately. He says that it was Plato and the Greek mystery school, think Pythagoras, Plato, they were the ones who empowered humans toward democracy, toward widespread literacy, toward all of the very specific points I've covered. He's coming from the exact opposite. Like on this many points, we're head on clashing.
Yeah, yeah,
But isn't it fascinating? My simple point is, isn't it fascinating that that's what it's come down to? That it gives you insight into what the root issues actually are here. What's at stake?
yeah,
Who gets credit for what? That's what this whole Babel versus Bible warfare is coming down to: is who empowers the common man, who
yeah.
has the
Well, and that seems to be kind of the root of Gnosticism or dualism, is that there would be this thing, and then there would be this information or idea, good, that man would somehow come up with separate from spirit. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if Plato came up with this idea, it's like, well, if it's a good idea, if it, and this is based off of a biblical worldview, if it's good, if it's true, if it's pure, if it's worthwhile, well, that it comes from the Lord. Like, there is no separating
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
Um, just like,
All edifying wisdom.
John 1.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, just like John 1, all things were made through him. There was nothing that.
Right.
So there's this inseparable
Mm-hmm.
aspect of light, love, goodness, justice, righteousness.
Right. Absolutely.
If it
It
if
all
it's
comes
good,
from above.
it all comes from above. So
It all comes from the Lord,
yeah,
and He's the fountain of life. In fact, all of that's built into the Holy Spirit's analogy as living water. It's fascinating. But
yeah,
that guy I just mentioned, Dr. Giorgiani, he specifically credits Prometheus as being Lucifer, as being the true light bearer. So we're just getting the same regurgitated Gnostic
yeah.
arguments over and over again. But it does come down to that practical question: who's looking out for mankind's welfare at the end of the day, and who's giving versus who's giving the lip service?
Yeah.
So I think we can make a good case, Jeff, in the next couple of episodes that's what needs to be recovered in the church's messages, that God has been, the God of the Bible has been consistent throughout history, throughout His Word, throughout history, to do that, to edify mankind.
Yeah, and the Lord's justice is actually quite gracious. I mean, look at the cross.
Oh,
If that's perfect justice, that's no justice that we would ever come up with. That, like,
it's
you could have
amazing.
all of your sins wiped away,
You know
and
what?
in exchange for pure righteousness. Well, that's no justice that we could ever come up with. That's doesn't even sound like the definition of justice. So it's like,
It is amazing. Yeah.
yeah,
You hit on one of my favorite topics, like in theology. So I've been thinking about this recently. It's like, what is it? What there are different views on how did the cross justify us? How did the cross do its great work of reversing the world order, of enthroning man with God, or the Son of Man up in heaven, and all the outpouring of the spirits and all those amazing benefits? Why was it the turning point? The way I've come to see it is this: Jesus being the perfect Lamb of God. It goes back to the issue of corrupt courts. They held an illegal trial for Jesus' crucifixion. They planted false witnesses. The most delightful person on the planet, who pleased the Father flawlessly, was accused of the most horrendous things.
yeah,
And for the Father to let that happen, for the Father to actually let that succeed, He had only one choice but to put it right. He was backed into a corner, so to speak. But His justice demanded, since I let this happen to a perfectly innocent individual, and that is the apex of His wrath. Nothing could piss Him off more.
sure,
Nothing.
yeah.
That's worse than anything and all things combined.
Well, it's contrary. It's contrary to his very nature of truth.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
This is such a falsehood. How could he let that exist?
It's the epitome of injustice and anger.
Yeah,
And so how does He put that right? Well, there's only one thing I can do to put the situation right. You suffered as a man, Jesus, the Son of Man. Therefore, I'm going to exalt you to the highest throne as the Son of Man.
yeah,
And all the euphoria and excitement that comes with it, and all the benefits, meaning now our DNA has been brought up into the Trinity,
totally.
into the throne, and that's the basis for the Spirit's outpouring into all flesh.
Yeah.
It's scientific, in my opinion. It's beautiful. It's amazing, but there are, for these people who call God a bully, it's amazing because the reverse accusation could kind of be made. It's like, you're taking too long to execute justice, God. But what kind of, but like you said, what kind of justice? Well, it turns out He's saying No, the most just thing I can do is empower you to be my carriers of justice, my vessels, and to bring this thing to a head to where you're the kind of people who can be entrusted to govern the universe for eternity with stable peace, righteousness, having learned your lessons from history. Anyways,
Yeah.
it's all fascinating stuff. But I guess that's a good place to stop, huh?
Yeah, and that's a good kind of segue into where we'll head next, which I think is great. And if there's any gaps in it need to be filled along the way, we can fill those. But it seems like we've laid a pretty good foundation of like, well, here's what's going on, and here's where it comes from, and now it's like, well, what do we do about it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.